Very excited to announce our speaker today. You can come on up, is our Pastor Doug, our executive pastor here. He's incredible. And I would just ask you to open up your heart and let's receive the word today. Amen? Amen. Amen.
Amen. Thanks. All right. Well, today, Pastor Greg is in Henrietta, and I just want to take the first part of my message. And could we just lift our hands to Henrietta campus right now and just pray that God would just bless Pastor Greg at the Henrietta campus, bless the message and the worship and all the work that's being done there. Lives would be changed in Henrietta, Lord. We thank you for this in your name. Amen. We are in a relationship series right now. Pastor Greg kicked it off last week. The title of the series is called Fixer Uppers, and the whole idea is that whenever we're in a relationship, there's a little bit of fixing up that needs to happen, and the whole spin on this series is that the fixer-upper is us. I'm the one that needs to be fixed up. Rather than me trying to fix somebody else up and trying to fix their issues, I need to start with myself. And we're going to follow along in that theme today with our message. And today's message is going to be all about boundaries in relationships, boundaries, okay? And I want to start with a couple assumptions on these boundaries. The first assumption is this: we all have and need boundaries in our lives that help us live and have healthy relationships. Common ground for all of us. We all have boundaries, right? They're all necessary. The second one is we all need to work on our boundaries. That's the other common ground that we have. These are things that should change over time, and these are things that should adapt as our lives change. Some of us need to actually construct boundaries because there's some unhealthy areas of our lives that need some boundaries. And some of us need to deconstruct or move some boundaries that have been established that might be outdated or unnecessary or were constructed because of unhealthy mindsets, and they need to actually come down. And we're going to talk about those. But what I am going to do is I'm going to challenge all of us today to work on our relational boundaries. That's going to be definitely the common ground. Now, last week, Pastor Greg started talking about the life of Moses, and I want to continue looking at the life of Moses because I feel like he gives us some really great examples of how to manage boundaries in our lives, okay? Now, in the very, physical realm, Moses had a lot to do with, actual physical boundaries, okay? He was born in a family, a Hebrew family, that was living inside of another nation as slaves. He was born inside the boundaries of another nation that wasn't his own. That's a really big boundary issue, right? And then later on in his life, he leaves Egypt and he goes out into the wilderness. He crosses that boundary. He spends a lot of time out there. God calls him back into Egypt. He goes across that boundary. He brings the Israelite people out of Egypt, and then he's confronted with a very real boundary, which was called the Red Sea, and then God caused that to split open, and they walked through that, and he was called to take the people to the Promised Land. He was able to see that boundary and never cross it, but he was certainly a man who was accustomed to a lot of different boundary changes. But one thing that can be said about Moses for sure is that he learned how to survive in a world with no physical boundaries because he spent a great deal of his life in the wilderness, which meant that his boundaries were always being tested when it comes to relationships. And just to kind of do a quick survey of relationships in Moses' life, you've got the Egyptians, the oppressors. You also have his home, the Hebrew people, the Israelites. They were another type of relationship that he was managing. Then you have his family, his wife, his children, and his extended family, and brothers and sisters, and father-in-law and whatnot. And then, of course, there's Pharaoh and many other people. These are all relationships that Moses had to navigate, and that makes his life really fertile ground for us to look at what it looks like to have boundaries in our lives. And Moses shows us some good boundaries and some bad boundaries, and so we're going to look at all those. First thing I want to say is boundaries are meant to keep us grounded. Don't think of boundaries as either good or bad or good or evil. Think of them as helpful in us designing a healthy lifestyle. And we can have bad boundaries and good boundaries, but the boundaries themselves are the ones that we want to examine. And boundaries are kind of important because if you have a boundary set up and it gets violated, it gets really personal really fast. You ever notice that? You don't even have to look very far for a very real world example. Crystal just was talking about in her prayer about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. There's a major boundary issue there, and it got really personal really fast. And it's the same as for us, is that when we have boundaries and they get violated or they get moved, we kind of take it very personal. So that makes this topic very important because the consequences can be very, very real and personal, of course. Second thing I want to say is that I want you to expect that your relational boundaries are going to be challenged, okay? We live in a world where our boundaries are always going to be having to be changed and moved and challenged. And Moses' story begins with him living in a world that doesn't hold his values for faith, family, or morality. It's a very different life he's living a very different life than those who he's around. And so what I want to do is take a little time and I want to look at Moses' story. Picking up in Exodus chapter 1, starting in the middle of verse 12. The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Now, the Egyptians came to dread them because they were increasing in number, and they were worried about an uprising and worried about whether or not they would be able to control the Israelites. And so they began to dread them. And so they made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields, and all of their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that a baby is a boy, kill him, and if it's a girl, let her live. That's a very evil, despicable thing to do, right? But this is how concerned they were, and they were so desperate they were actually willing to kill children. However, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" Now, they thought up a very good reason really quick. They said, the midwives answered Pharaoh, "The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And so the intensity increases, and so does Pharaoh's action, because then Pharaoh gave this order, not just to the midwives, but to all the people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. This is the world that Moses was born into, this incredibly hostile environment. And we can relate to Moses here because we also live in a world that is not like ours. Not the way that doesn't hold the same beliefs and values and see family the same way that we do. And so our boundaries are always going to be challenged. And so not only did Moses live in this time, but he was also very unique in that he ends up living in the house of Pharaoh for most of his life. And he's living around people more so than the average Israelite would have, because in that time, the Egyptians lived in one area and the Israelites lived in another area, but that wasn't true for Moses. He actually lived in it, very much the way that you and I do. So let's continue the story. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister, her name is Miriam, stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister, Miriam, asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother, Moses' mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." Now, this has nothing to do with what I talk about today, but I just love how this story worked out. That what people intended for evil, God actually made incredible good to come out of it. And Moses was actually able to be nursed by his mother, and she got paid for it on top of it. That is really, really good. That's how God works, right? That's awesome. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." This is the world that Moses was living in now. This is the house that he was being raised in. His grandfather was bent on killing all the men, all the baby boys of his age. And Moses ended up being rescued by the very people who were seeking to kill him. And God put him right in the middle of people who were not living for God. Now, we fast forward a little bit, and Moses is now spending about 40 years in Pharaoh's house, okay? We don't hear much about his story until we get to 40 years later. Now, Moses, he goes out into the city to see how the Israelite people are being treated. Maybe he heard rumors of how they were being treated and he didn't see himself. Maybe he knew about it, but he'd never seen it with his own eyes. But when he does see it with his own eyes, he reacts very strongly. He sees an Egyptian man whipping and beating a Hebrew man, and he reacts. He follows the Egyptian, and he kills him, what he thinks is in secret, and he buries the body because he was just so offended by what was going on. And he thought that it was in secret, but it wasn't in secret, because it wasn't too much longer when he interrupted an argument between two other Hebrew men, and their reaction was, "What, are you going to kill us too?" And in that moment, Moses realized that the jig was up, that he was going to be found out for murder, and that his grandfather was going to have him killed for murder. And so he decided that he needed to flee. And so he, not wanting to be killed by Pharaoh, he escapes into the wilderness. And this is where Moses' story picks up. He's in his 40s now, and he is on the run. And I like that Moses' story really starts when he's an adult, because it tells me two things. Doesn't matter what age we are when our story starts with God. And two, we're not disqualified by our past. Because God wanted a yes from Moses, and that was what was going to qualify him, not his past, right? So Moses became a nomad. He went out into the wilderness. He was somewhat of a loner, but over the next 40 years, he spent his time in the wilderness as a fugitive. But if you look at his life, in the time that he was in, Moses, at the age of 80, has a very happy ending. He ends up finding a family to be a part of. He marries into that family. He ends up having children in that family. He's tending the flocks of his father-in-law. He has a job and income and in a good spot of his life. And he's 80 years old, and everyone would look at that and say, now that was an actual happy ending to someone who's being hunted and killed by a ruthless leader. He ended up with a really good story. But then God calls Moses. And this first encounter with God is the first boundary that God deals with in Moses' life. And this is his time with God. He confronts him in such a way that he sets a standard of how Moses is going to interact with him for all the years to come. And so the way that the story goes is that Moses was tending the flock, his father-in-law's flock, and he sees a burning bush in the desert. Now, I've lived in the desert, and I know a couple things about fires in the desert. One is a fire consumes really, really quickly because things are very dry. And two, it spreads very quickly because everything is so dry, and they're called wildfires. So Moses, he sees this burning bush, and it's quite alarming if you're in the desert and you see something burning, but he's looking at it longer, and he realizes that it's not being consumed. Something is special about this fire, so he begins to approach it. And as he approaches, God speaks to him and says, Moses, take off your sandals, for this is holy ground. And that's what he does. And so this is the first boundary that God establishes with Moses, spending time with him. And this marks the beginning of Moses learning the value of being in God's presence. And I think that this is a value that we all need to be regularly reminded of, is that we don't want to neglect the boundary of having set apart time with God. I like that this is the first thing that God does in his interaction with Moses, is calling him apart to spend time with him. Because Moses ended up putting a really big boundary around his relationship with God. Moses was known more than anyone of his time of having alone time with God. And we access him the same way, by spending alone time with God. Now notice that I'm not saying that Moses was a loner, but he was called to be alone with God. The two very, very different things. We're not called to be loners, we're called to be alone with God. And so this time with God gives you strength and wisdom, and this is exactly what happened. Now, including this time where Moses met God at the burning bush. The Bible has at least 8 times where he calls Moses to be apart with him. Moses climbs mountains. Moses sets himself apart to meet with God. King David and Jesus and others in the Bible model the same exact thing. It's the importance of establishing a very important boundary, and this boundary is our alone time with God. And when I get to the end of the message today, I'm going to come back to this one, because this one is the one that I want us to hear, that when we start to get this right, when we start to get our alone time with God set, that boundary around that, that's when all the other boundaries start making sense. And this is why I believe that God met with Moses in such a powerful way. But now let's look at what happens here at the bush, okay? So then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Basically, is what's happening here is like this is incredibly good news that God is giving Moses, because the suffering that he has witnessed for 80 years, God is saying, I've seen it, and now I'm going to do something about it. You know, and I imagine that Moses was pretty excited. He's probably thinking, man, there is never good news on the Burning Bush channel. And finally, there's some good news. Someone's reporting good news, and I love it, right? He's excited, but wait, there's more. So now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses was not expecting this. This one definitely took him by surprise. What I like about what's happening here, again, is that God is not limited by our stage of life, whatever our age is, young or old. That part doesn't matter, because when God calls us, he promotes us. Moses didn't have all the standing that he needed to accomplish this. He was called, and God's plan for Moses exceeded his capabilities. His social network was gone. He left Egypt. That was not there. He had no status anymore. And God had a plan for Moses. And I would like to tell you that Moses' reaction was, wow, God, I'm so honored that you chose me. I've been waiting for this opportunity my whole life. Finally, people are going to listen to me. No, that wasn't Moses' reaction at all, was it? He basically was saying, I'm sorry, you have the wrong guy. That's what he was saying. I almost imagine like he was like looking around to see if anybody else was watching the Burning Bush channel, because certainly somebody else is better for this mission than him. He was convinced. But what ends up happening is Moses ends up following God's mission, and he goes into the nation of Egypt to save the people of Israel and to confront Pharaoh. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Moses' reaction, but I want to just take a pause here and talk about Moses' yes, because this yes that he made is another boundary that Moses did a really great job with. So his next boundary was one of including the people closest to him inside the boundary of his calling, and that is the people that were in his family. Now, I'd never thought of this before until I was reading this through this filter. If you'd asked me, so what did Moses do with his family once he received the call to go into Egypt? My memory was not good enough to be able to say that he took them with him, but that's exactly what he did. Because common sense would have said, you're going into like one of the most hostile type of situations you could possibly imagine. And you have, kids and a wife, and you're going to bring them with you. I would be thinking, man, I want to protect them from this. I want to set them aside from this. I don't want to just include them right into that. Or maybe I would have been thinking, well, this is my mission. It wasn't really their mission, so I'll do it. And no, that's not what he did at all. Moses, so let's look at the verse and see what happened here. So then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive. Jethro said, go, and I wish you well. Now the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead. So Moses took his wife and sons and put them on a donkey and started back to Egypt. And he took the staff of God in his hand. Now, this is what is coming clear to me. As we follow God, we need to include our family. this is what Moses did. He didn't leave them behind because the work was so important or so dangerous. And the other thing that I noticed about this is that he put his wife and kids on the same donkey, which means they probably weren't adult children. They probably were small children. And I think that there's a lot of times when we have kids and our life situation changes, maybe we get newly married or we have some kids, there's this temptation to sequester our family off from everything that we've been accustomed to for this new normal. And this isn't what Moses did at all. He said, no, this is something that we're going to go and do together. I'm not going to spend less time with you in the mission that God has for me. I'm going to spend more time. He brought the family with him. And I think that it's good for us to have maybe a season where we set aside a new family or a new marriage so that they have time to kind of establish themselves. But notice I said that it's a season. It's not years. And I think if I could put a little bit of advice on this, is that whenever you go into a season, you know what it needs to look like to get out of that season. You just don't go into a season and say, I'm just going to change this dynamic in my life. I'm going to kind of sequester my family aside for a while and then wait till it feels right. You kind of know, okay, this is going to be a certain amount of time. It's months. And I think it's probably worth saying that most seasons aren't years long. They're usually months long. And so my advice to any new families and young families, and as your family dynamic changes, is avoid the temptation to sequester and seclude your family away from all the relationships that you've had, but lean into your church family. Lean into working and being together as a family. It'll go really far. So Moses brings his family with him. But now let's go back and talk about his reaction, because there's a good lesson for us to pull up on here, and that is our desire to use boundaries, often self-constructed unhealthy ones, to escape and create walls for us to avoid the risk of moving into a new season or a new work, okay? Sometimes we construct boundaries when we're in an unhealthy mindset, and these boundaries can push us out of God's will, and I want to look at a couple of them from Moses' life. The first one is when we are confronted with something new and it feels like risky. I'm sure Moses was thinking, this is a huge risk for me to go and do this, and so the first thing that he does is he starts throwing excuses at the problem. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to escape it. Think of the prophet Jonah. When God called him, he threw excuses at God's calling, and then he got on a boat and left. And this is basically what Moses is trying to do. He's throwing excuses at God, and if he had been successful in the excuses, then he never would have been a part of God's plan to save the Israelites. The excuses that he did. The first one he said is, "Who am I?" Now, of course, God, he says, "Don't worry about that. I'm going to be with you." But Moses was questioning his identity. And then the next excuse was, well, what if people question my authority? And God says, well, you're going to go with my power. But what Moses was thinking about was that his status disqualified him. And then his next excuse was, what if people don't believe me? And he was thinking that this was based on his own credibility, but it wasn't. And then he said, well, you know what? I'm not good with people. I'm not good with words. And what Moses is saying is this is all about my lack of skills. And God says, I will teach you. And Moses and God kind of have this back and forth about this. And then God finally relinquishes and says, fine, I'm still going to speak through you, but you can use Aaron as a helper if you need help talking to other people. And that's the compromise that God gave Moses. What I think is interesting is that once you read the story of all Moses' interactions with Pharaoh, he pretty much does all the talking. I wonder why he brought Aaron along in the first place. But you see, our excuses can construct boundaries around our life that keep us in the same space for years or in a lane we were never meant to live in. But we use them as an escape, and they just derail us because we weren't being obedient, and it's pushing us out of obedience. And so those excuses are very dangerous because they push us into a mode of escape. The second kind of boundary that was being constructed around Moses' life was this secluded life that Moses had lived. He lived as a loner in Pharaoh's house, and then he went into the wilderness and lived as a loner for the next 40 years of his life. And the one boundary that God was calling Moses out of was the boundary of seclusion. God was saying, Moses, you can't do my mission and be separated from the people you were meant to save. Going it alone is so far so far from God's best for you and to accomplish the mission that he gave us, which is to reach others and to share Jesus' love, we have to be around the people that God is calling us to reach. We can't put these protective bubbles around our lives and think that we're going to be effective in reaching those who need to hear and know God. And so I believe that God is calling us in this day out of seclusion. And I believe that through the pandemic and everything that we've been through, that the message of the church has been lost by the frenzy of the arguments and the disagreements and the debates of the day. And God is calling us out of seclusion, and not to join the debate, but to be the voice of hope that everyone has been waiting for. And so our mission as a people of God, and it's the same one that Moses had. He says, I'm calling you out of seclusion to bring hope to my people. And God is really saying to the church, all the stuff that's been going on, I'm calling you out of seclusion, and I want you to be the voice of hope to my people. And there's so many of us that we have been so disrupted by COVID and all the things that have been going on that we have formed new pathways of seclusion around our own lives. We stay home more. We don't interact with people as much, even our own neighbors. Many of us even changed our patterns in how we go to church, and we maybe watch online more than we ever have before in our life. And we might even feel good about that because it does feel pretty good to sit in your PJs and check out church. But I believe that God is calling us back into the family, to be back into community, and it's time for us to come together, right? Yeah. And if you got to come to church in your pajamas, I won't judge you. Just get in here. Now, I know that there are certain people that need to be protected for really good reasons, but I know that that's not most of us. And so I know that what I feel God is saying is like, this message for coming out of seclusion is for the church of today, that we would be able to bring this message of hope. Moving out of seclusion requires us to hone our ability to communicate and work with other people the way that we don't like to. It's not fun to work with people when it starts to get a little nasty. Moses lived this so many times. He was trying to save the Israelites, and they complained the entire time that he was trying to save them. And, you know, this idea of working through relationships is so hard and so important that it's important for us to actually get good at getting better at communicating. And this is my shameless plug for the Communications Masterclass for Pastor Josh. That being said, Moses countless times had to save people from their own foolishness and their own lack of faith. And it was through those experiences that he never would have had that. He never would have grown as the man of God called him to be if he hadn't stepped out of seclusion. And so our challenge is to move out of seclusion. Next boundary lesson I want to talk about is this idea of blind spots. We need other people in our lives that can help us see blind spots that need boundaries, because we can't see it all. And I want to give a couple examples here. Setting up boundaries to avoid burnout. Now, Moses, after he had rescued the people from Israel, and I'm not going to go into the whole story of that. That's a whole other story of how he confronted Pharaoh. Really great reading and a lot of great life lessons in that. But now he's in the wilderness with the people, and he is just being lambasted with problems all the time. And so during this time, he's getting burnt out. And so if you're like Moses in this season, being around others is stressing you out, or you're feeling pulled in too many directions, it's possible that you are doing something that Moses was doing, which he was saying yes to everything and saying yes to the wrong things. And it was making him less available for the most important things in his life. Because our lives, they operate with a very set, balanced budget of time. We can't buy any more time than there already exists. All we can do is get better at saying yes to the right things and no to the right things. Because saying yes to one thing is always saying no to something else, whether you do it on purpose or incidentally. There is no innocent yes. When you say yes, you always are saying yes to something and no to something else. And so during this time, Moses got burnt out, and his lack of boundaries around his time put him in a position of being pulled on everyone about everything. And he was charged of making decisions for the whole nation, deciding legal issues, resolving civil issues between people, being the main connection of the people to God, and dealing with supply issues and transportation issues and all those kinds of things, and whatever his family needed as well. He was being pulled in so many directions. And so he has this confrontation with his father-in-law, who ends up giving Moses the greatest understatement of all time. Moses' father-in-law replied, "What you are doing is not good." That's really all he needed to hear, right? "You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone." A couple things are happening here. One is Moses is receiving good advice from somebody else because he has a blind spot. And Moses is also realizing that he's not meant to do all the work by himself. When we lack relational boundaries, it's not good for us, and it's not good for the other people that are around us either. That's what Jethro is saying to him. Somebody here today needs to hear that you are not meant to do it all. Okay, and that's for you. Because Jethro had Moses, and he helped him set up a system of care and delegation. But what was happening is that Moses was learning how to say yes to the right things and no to the right things. Now, notice when Jethro said this, that Moses didn't become a nomad again. He didn't completely sequester himself off from that. He didn't have a knee-jerk reaction, be like, you know what, you're right. I'm just going to get alone with God. I'm going to be alone with God, and that's all I'm ever going to do, and I'm not going to deal with any other people. That wasn't the answer. He had to be strategic about how he was saying yes and how he was saying no. And I think that we can have the same temptation to make boundaries unhealthy. But people are meant to stretch us. We're supposed to have relationships in our lives. But if certain relationships are pulling you out of health and into unhealthy mindsets, then it's time to think about boundaries. But don't neglect the relationships altogether, because we don't want to be put in a position where we are totally separate from relationships, and we don't want to be in a position where we're like Moses and we can only be superficial with everyone because we're so pulled in so many different directions we can't have any deep relationships. Proverbs 27:17 doesn't say, as butter sharpens iron, so one superficial relationship is meant to strengthen another. It does not say that. It says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And this is what Moses had to realize, is that you couldn't be everything to everyone and have only superficial relationships, but you had to have boundaries so that you could actually have those deep relationships. So I want to talk about setting up good boundaries now. How do we do this? Well, it's involved, what I'm saying is moving our boundaries. We need to set up boundaries around relationships that help us become more effective in pursuing our call. Now, like with Moses, if you're married, you make boundaries to have a healthy family. This has got to be a huge priority for us. Nothing that we are doing, that we're involved in, or any call that we have should cause us to ever sacrifice our family. It's very important for us to prioritize our family. If you are not married and you have kids and you have other people in your household, it is important for you to prioritize those family relationships, because they should never suffer for the work that we're doing. Now, whether you're single or married, or what your family situation is, it's important for us to make boundaries to have a healthy frame of mind, to keep us out of things that pull us away from God, that draw us into the things that give us the most amount of trouble, that cause us to stumble and to step into sin. And this is where boundaries make and play a really huge role. When I was pastoring in Las Vegas, you can imagine that there's a lot of people that have gambling addictions. And I was working with one man who was working with a gambling addiction, and he kept failing over and over again. And he would hide it, and then it would blow up in his face, and then he'd have to deal with it. And this was the cycle that he was in. And when I was counseling him, what I said is that, I said, you need better boundaries in your life to help protect you from yourself. And this is where boundaries can become really effective. And for him, those boundaries were this. He needed one person where he could be completely honest with, who had permission to ask him any question that they wanted to ask, and that person knew that they were that person. That was one relationship he needed, that there was no pretense of hiding, and this person would never burn him. It would always be for him and would be able to be there, that he could be honest with. The second boundary that he needed is that he needed a small group to be in. He needed people that he could experience life with and rely on and grow with. That's a very important part of being in a healthy mindset. And the third one that he needed was he needed that alone time with God. How are you setting up that space for you to be alone with God? Those were the boundaries that helped him. And I was a pastor of the singles ministry, and he was a single adult that was just blowing up his life left and right. And through those boundaries and him going after God, everything turned around for him. And those boundaries were instrumental. And those are the kind of boundaries that we need to create, the boundaries that save us from our own kind of weaknesses and failures. Now, some of us need to get out an eraser and remove boundaries that are keeping us from people, that are keeping us from being away from the very people we're meant to reach, love, and save, like I was talking about earlier. These people are people who are living a lifestyle that you don't agree with. These are people who have hurt you in the past, and they don't deserve to be inside your boundaries. These are people that you would prefer not to spend time with, because you're not currently spending time with them, but God is asking you to erase that boundary. One thing that I love that Pastor Josh always said when he would talk about relational boundaries is that if someone draws a circle around themselves to exclude me, I'll draw a bigger circle around them to include them. This is what it means to move boundaries, is to go after people. Now, Moses, he was burned many times by the people that he was trying to help. They disobeyed him. They turned on their faith. And if he allowed those hurts to be the reason for him to stop reaching and saving them, then many of them would never have known their own story of redemption. And so we want to include people in our boundaries who are called to support and help. And this idea of moving boundaries becomes much more possible when we get the right relationships in our lives to help us to be able to do this. And Moses had 3 relationships that I want to highlight really quickly that helped him with this. The first one we already talked about, and that is Jethro. Jethro was the type of person that Moses had in his life and kept him close because he gave him good advice. Moses asked Jethro before he ever even went to Egypt because he trusted his judgment. We need people like Jethro in our lives. Moses had Aaron in his life. Aaron was able to help him. Aaron is the proof that Moses couldn't do it by himself. He needed other people, and we need Aarons in our lives that walk alongside of us and help us to be able to do the thing that we're called to do. And then I love that Moses had Miriam in his life at the riverbank looking out for him. Throughout his whole life, Miriam with him, looking out for him. And this is incredibly important to setting up good boundaries in our lives, is having other people to help us do that. But I want to talk about our first boundaries to take down and our first boundaries to set up in my closing of the message today. The first boundary to take down is the one that is holding you back from following God's call on your life. That's the one we got to take down. And that might be you saying yes to Jesus for the very first time. That might mean you saying yes to Jesus because you've been saying no to Jesus for a while, and it's time to surrender that. But he's looking for you to take down that boundary. And this might mean that you need to step out of the layers of protection that you've created around yourself, even the ones you set up for really good reason, and follow God's call to save other people. And this might mean spending more time with those who don't follow God. You know, one of the most amazing stories I ever have been able to witness myself of this boundary coming down was the story of Sharon and her dad. Sharon's dad said and did things to her as a child that I would never wish on anybody. And if there was somebody that was not deserving of being in Sharon's circle, in her boundary of personal relationships, it was her dad. He had violated them all. He was unrepentant, and he was vicious. And I never even pressed Sharon to do anything that she wasn't comfortable doing. But one day she came to me and she says, I want to call my dad and I want to tell him that I forgive him and that I want him in my life. And this was such an amazing thing that she did. And I remember sitting next to her when she was on the phone with him, because I was listening to what was happening, and it was like you could really sense that something amazing was taking place. And it was a rather short call, and nothing miraculous happened like right in that moment. But that boundary coming down did a few things. First and foremost, Sharon's dad ended up knowing Jesus before he passed away. That was awesome. But he also had a relationship with Sharon and Sharon's sister and with his grandkids that he never would have had if she hadn't taken down that boundary. And so when we're called to take down these boundaries and to circle others that maybe have sequestered us off, this is such an important boundary for us to take down. Now, the one that I want us to talk about setting up is the very first one that I talked about. And this boundary that Moses set up with God, this personal time that he had with him to get into God's presence, was formational in his ability to be able to carry out the call that he had on his life. And it's the one that I want to challenge all of us today to really think about. What does it look like for you to mature this boundary around the time that you have alone with God? And I have a very simple exercise for you to consider doing this week and just taking an inventory of this. Can you write down on a piece of paper what it means for you to have alone time with God? Can you describe that? Like where does that take place? When does that take place? What is that like for you? If you can describe that, then that means that it's already there, and that's good. If you really struggle with that, then it's time to actually maybe write out what you want it to look like, how you want to have God to be able to meet you in those times, because it's in these times that we find our strength. And it's in these times that when we spend alone time with God and we lift him up, that he begins to download his nature into us and he lifts us up. And this is the one that if we only worked on one boundary this week, of all the ones that I've mentioned that are so important for us to get right, this is the one that I would love to leave us with. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want us to just take this time right now and just sample once again this time of being in God's presence. I want to invite you to stand up, and I want us to sing this song, the chorus of lifting Jesus high. We lift you up. And let's take this time to allow God's presence to maybe take away some of these boundaries that have been unhealthy or unnecessary or that need to come down in order for us to be on mission with God. And maybe he's calling us to rise up together as a church out of seclusion and to raise a voice of hope for the world around us.